My name is Lawrence Lessig, and I'm a professor of law at Harvard Law School. So what I perceived in the context of this fight about how to restore the republic or to end the corruption that I think is debilitating the democracy, I thought that the basic problem was that people saw this in a very political way, a left-right way. And it struck me that the issue was not left-right, that there was a fundamental understanding of the problem of this type of corruption that cut across political boundaries. And I was very keen to frame the story in a way that made people see this connection and help bring people along to this fight without them feeling tied to some political perspective. So my objective with the book was to tell a story that would bring people to a place that they could recognize how profound the corruption is that we face, but what kind of corruption that is that we face, and therefore the urgent need to do something about it with the beginnings of thoughts about what that thing is that we should be doing. Well, there are a couple ideas that are built into what I want people to take away from it. Number one is a certain sense of why this is corruption, what makes it corruption. And it's not corruption because it's evidence of criminal behavior by members of Congress. Instead, it's a different kind of corruption. It's a corruption of a system rather than a corruption of individuals. And that system is corrupted because the influences that campaign funding impose upon members and the way that they do their job systematically distorts them from the perspective they would have if what they were concerned about is what the people cared about. So I wanted people to understand this sense of corruption. And then number two, recognize what follows from that, how we might eliminate this sense of corruption. And what kind of political steps would be necessary to bring about this type of reform. Well, I think that a lot of attention has been paid to the president as, in some sense, the focus of where we need to reform. And I can understand why people were inspired to think about the presidency as this locus of corruption when you think about Nixon and the images of that type of presidency. But I actually think the president is not a critically important target of reform because in many ways the design of the office and the modern presidency drives presidents to be thinking about their own conception of the public good, but still a conception of the public good. And instead, we've got to recognize that other half of the legislative process, which is Congress, where conceptions of the public good can too easily be distorted by perceptions of exactly how best to raise campaign funds. So until we reform Congress, it doesn't matter what happens at the president level. And I think if we did reform Congress, then there's a good chance we could get a president and a Congress together that could do things that would restore confidence to the American people. It's not that localities are more subject to corruption. It's just that the influence of money in the life of a congressperson is much more salient, much more significant. You know, the President of the United States spends a significant amount of his time, unfortunately, raising money. But he doesn't spend 30 to 70% of his time raising money. So, you know, there's certainly a sensitivity that the President has about how certain issues are going to make it hard for him to raise money. So the President in this election cycle had to worry about financial reform undermining his ability to raise money from Wall Street, no doubt. But it's not inside of his head all the time, every day, the way it is for a member of Congress. So it's very easy to see the way in which that influence in the context of Congress begins to bend them in ways that are destructive and maybe not as clear in the context of the president. Nobody who crafted our Constitution ever had any conception of campaign finance the way it is today. They didn't even have a conception of campaigning the way it is today. The idea of even running for office, putting yourself out there as a candidate, was anathema to the framers. And so there's nothing from their design that sort of would help us understand what, in fact, we've produced. So I think it's more a product of the way in which competition between the parties for control of Congress has driven both parties to behave in ways which even 30 years ago would have been unrecognizable by many in Congress. It's just this driving competition to wage this perpetual war between the Republicans and the Democrats that has produced a world where neither side can get anything done, even when they're in the majority or supermajority in Congress. Yeah, so, you know, I think that the current dynamic is driven by the extraordinary competition that exists between Democrats and Republicans for control of Congress. And that competition is relatively recent in origin. For much of the history of the 20th century, Congress was institutionally democratic. It wasn't really possible to imagine the Republicans taking control for a sustained period of time of both the Senate and the House. But as the Democrats became more active supporting civil rights legislation, the demographics of the parties began to change. And when Ronald Reagan capitalized on a revived conservative movement, he really built a political party that was increasingly competitive with the Democrats. And so when Newt Gingrich oversaw the final victory of the Republicans taking control of the House for the first time in 40 years, it woke the Democratic Party up to the fact that they were not the presumptive majority party anymore. They were going to have to work for that. Now, you know, in most of our life, we think competition is great, and competition is typically great, but sometimes competition can drive an institution to behave in ways which is really destructive. So that's what happened with financial services, and that's what happened with Congress. They've become so competitive and therefore need to raise so much money to win their elections that the job of being a congressman is shifted from the job of figuring out what's in the public interest or what's in the interest of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to what's the way to raise the most money to get your party back in power. And that change, beginning with Gingrich and really taking off in the first part of this century, has radically changed the character of Congress. And I think until we address that fundamental change, we're not going to have a hope to fixing Congress. Yeah, so the problem isn't competition on its own. The problem is competition that gets waged through a fight about raising money. So if the competition were a competition about getting the most votes, that would be healthy. You know, it would be like both parties are fighting hard to attract the right kind of voter to get to the majority position. And if we had competitive districts and not an obsessive focus on raising money, that might be productive and conducive to a more responsive democracy. But given the way we fund elections, the way competition manifests itself is an ever more intense fight to raise money from the tiniest slice of the top 1% of America. So as members become more obsessed with raising money, they listen more carefully to the concerns of those fraction of the top 1% who are going to fund campaigns. So, you know, right now, in 2010, 0.26% of Americans gave more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05% of Americans gave the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave more than $10,000 in the election cycle. So that's a tiny fraction of the top 1% that has an enormous influence inside the political system because the political system depends upon them to fund their campaigns. Now, if we had a different way of funding campaigns, it wouldn't be that kind of dynamic. They'd depend upon someone, but it wouldn't be this tiny slice of the top 1%. And that's the critical difference, I think, about a healthy competitive system and an unhealthy competitive system. So if we had the right way to fund campaigns, the kind of corruption that I'm talking about would disappear. It's not to say we'd have utopia. It's not to say we'd have Congress that would react to what the people want. It's not to say that there wouldn't be special interests that have more power than the general interest. It's just to say that the particular pathology of a Congress obsessed on its funders, obsessed with its funders as opposed to obsessed with what the people want, would have disappeared. And we can, then return to the fight about how to make democracy responsive and all the other democratic reforms we need in order to make it responsive. But it takes that first step before we're going to have this change. So what I mean by corruption is not Rob Blagojevich or Randy Duke Cunningham or William Jefferson. I'm not talking about anybody breaking the law, engaging in quid pro quo bribery, selling access, selling government favors. I'm talking about a much more systematic legal form of corruption that gets played out in a very elaborate dance by lobbyists and the clients they represent and the members of Congress who are increasingly dependent upon these lobbyists and the money that they can facilitate to fund their campaigns. So that legal process with decent, honest people just working inside a system which they didn't build but they have to try to master, delivers the same kind of influence to special interests as the old corrupt form of bribery did, but maybe more effective, more powerfully, more dramatically than the old form of corruption did. Because at least with the old form of corruption, there was shame inside the system. People were embarrassed, and they wouldn't sort of openly describe how they had bought a member of Congress. This new type of system, there's no shame. There's nothing to hide. It's all perfectly transparent. The influence that comes from raising endless amounts of money is the way to demonstrate your power. And so in this legal form of corruption, as I call it, we have special interests exacerbating the problem of democracy with this influence that money brings to this table. And that's corruption because if the Constitution imagined a democracy where Congress would be, as Federalist 52 puts it, dependent upon the people alone, then we've produced a democracy where Congress is not dependent upon the people alone. Congress is dependent upon the funders, as well as the people, but the funders. And the funders are not the people, so that dependency is conflicting with the dependency upon the people and in that sense corrupting. Yeah, certainly the defenders of the existing system move from a very simple premise, which is freedom of speech is important, to an undefended conclusion, which is any effort to restrict the speech within the political marketplace is illegitimate. And in particular, in Citizens United, the court embraced a very narrow conception of corruption in concluding that independent expenditures could not be corrupting. Because in their view, corruption is quid pro quo bribery, and independent expenditures means expenditures that are not coordinated with the candidate. So it follows, as a matter of logic, that independent expenditures cannot be corruption because they cannot be coordinations with the candidate and therefore can't be quid pro quos and therefore do not fall afoul of criminal statutes and cannot be regulated against because the only ground to limit First Amendment speech is, quote, corruption. Now, my view is there's another sense of corruption here, which is just as compelling and just as obvious. Indeed, to the framers, it's the kind of corruption they were most concerned about. And that's not the corruption of bribery. It's the corruption of a system that is no longer focused on the right kind of dependency because it has the wrong kind of dependency that's been allowed to be entered into the mix. So the dependency upon the people was supposed to be exclusive. Instead, we have a dependency upon the funders, which competes with the dependency upon the people. And that, in the plainly obvious sense, corrupts the system. So in my view, Congress ought to have the power to address that corruption even more importantly than it has the power to address the corruption of bribery, because that corruption, the corruption of the existing system, is order of magnitude more significant in breaking this democracy than anything Rod Blagojevich or Randy Duke Cunningham ever did inside our system. So I think that it's just a mistaken conception of corruption that leads them to this view that independent expenditures are completely fine. And I think actually eventually they're going to recognize the mistake in that view. And when they do, they're going to reverse it and give at least Congress some power to limit independent expenditures where those expenditures raise this perception of coordinated corruption. Well, in designing the Constitution, as Zephyr Teachout in this brilliant piece she wrote called The Anti-Corruption Principle, the framers created all sorts of elaborate devices to channel the wrong kind of influences away from a decision maker. So at the core of this architecture was a conception of what independence for a decision maker meant. So independence for a judge doesn't mean the judge is free to do whatever the hell he wants. Independent judiciary means a judiciary that is dependent upon the law. And for a Congress, an independent Congress is not a Congress that gets to do whatever the hell it wants. It's a Congress that is dependent upon the people. And in both of those institutions, what you do is you try to eliminate influences that compete with this proper dependence. So with the judiciary, you insulate judges from politics so that the dependence they feel is a dependence upon the law, and they don't feel dependent upon the executive or upon Congress to make either happy in order to keep their job. And in the context of Congress, the framers were quite explicit about limiting influences that congressmen might face so as to protect the independence of Congress from those improper influences. So for example, the president is not allowed to appoint a sitting member of Congress to some federal office so that we don't create a situation where the president is just giving federal offices as a way of buying congressmen to his side. Likewise, a member of Congress cannot take an office where the pay for that office has been increased while that congressman was in Congress. So we don't create this incentive where people want to increase the pay for Secretary of State and then go become a Secretary of State. These are all limits the framers built in so that the congressperson would be focused where the congressperson was supposed to be focused, on the interests of the people, and limit the extent to which these distracting, distorting dependencies might undermine their ability to do what an independent Congress should do. Yeah, well, you could think about it like this. Imagine the Chinese government got it into its head that it wanted to influence the United States Congress. And so it went out there and started giving presents to members of Congress, you know, yachts or airplanes or big piles of money. The Constitution has built within it devices for blocking that kind of influence peddling by the Chinese. There's an explicit clause that forbids members of the government, congressmen and officers alike, from accepting gifts from any foreign state, king, or prince. So the framers were interested in creating the right kind of independence, protecting against the wrong sort of dependence. They put something in the Constitution to address that. Now, switch channels to corporations. Corporations are not citizens like the Chinese. They might be persons, but they're not citizens under the law. Bribery statutes, of course, forbid them from giving gifts, in this sense, to members of Congress. But if corporations start spending endless amounts of money to advance the interests of certain members of Congress by advertising in their favor in an election, it creates exactly the same kind of dependency that the anti-gifts cause is trying to address. And it creates exactly the same kind of concern. Maybe their focus is not on what the people want. Their focus is instead on what will get the corporation to spend the right money to support speech or to attack the opponent. The framers never thought about that. They never thought about that because they never had a conception of campaigns there you would spend millions of dollars to become a congressman or a senator or a president of the United States. It just wasn't a problem for them, just like nuclear waste was not a problem for them. But now it is a problem. And the question is, should we have the freedom within our constitutional system to create an equivalent kind of protection against that problem to the kind of protection they erected against the particular problem they were addressing? So I think that Congress should be free to assure the independence of members of Congress by regulating elections such that members of Congress are not shape-shifting to get the right kind of independent expenditures the way I think right now they're shape-shifting to get the right kind of contributions. Both of those kinds of shape-shifting are destructive, and I think that's the dynamic. Well, I think the framers of our Constitution were naive in expecting that Congress would be concerned about the institution of Congress first. And they were naive because they didn't expect parties to become so important. In fact, Washington thought we should be a one-party state. He thought political parties were just a manifestation of faction and we shouldn't allow this to emerge within our system. But very quickly, with the decline of the Federalists, the rise of the Jefferson Republicans, parties became critically important. And what they did was cement allegiance across institutions. So right now, what's important is the Democratic Party controlling the president and Congress, or the Republican Party controlling the president and Congress. And the idea of Congress standing up against the president, or the president taking on Congress, just doesn't happen because parties wallpaper over those institutional differences. And what that means is it's institutionally very difficult to figure out how you take on a failing, sick institution like Congress. It's not clear Congress has the capacity to cure itself, and it's not clear the president has the political will to take on that institution because, of course, if he alienates Congress, he gets nothing done because he can't pass anything on his own. So we don't actually have built into the system the framers gave us a very good way for regulating the health of this institution of Congress. And that's why I think it becomes critical to think about outsider influences that could bring about that kind of reform. Well, to understand financial regulation, you have to put it in context with the change in the competitiveness of Congress. So when Newt Gingrich took over in 1995, we had Republican control of the House. The Republicans made it very clear they were going to be waging this perpetual war to retain control of the House and keep control of the Senate so that they could control the government until they had a chance to elect a new president. And the Democrats recognized this was a huge fight they were going to have, and they were going to have to raise an enormous amount of money. And the most obvious target for that money was Wall Street, because Wall Street had a very keen sense of regulatory change that it wanted. Regulatory change in the form of deregulation to make it possible for them to experiment without regulatory oversight with these new innovations which we call derivatives. So beginning in the mid-1990s, the Clinton administration started cozying up to the Wall Street funders and signaling very clearly that they were going to be as Republican as the Republicans could be about deregulating Wall Street and allowing Wall Street to do whatever the hell it wanted. And so in a series of regulatory changes, which was capped by the abolishment of the Glass-Steagall Act, we changed banking and Wall Street in our economy from being a system where there was a very stable, secure, safe institution called banks, and not so safe, much more risky, much higher return institution called investment houses, into a financial system where those two were melded together. And banks were encouraged to gamble the way they gambled leading up to the crash, and they were so big and important to the economy that when they crashed, nobody could afford to let them fail. Now, that change in regulation was induced because of the need to raise endless amounts of money. And in some sense, you can understand why it happened, because at the same time that Congress saw this as the gold mine for campaign finance, economists were telling Congress that it was a really good idea to deregulate Wall Street. Now, of course, the economists were not telling Congress that they were being paid by Wall Street to say exactly that thing. But everybody was singing the same tune, so it's not surprising that Congress would go along with deregulation, since every time they lowered the regulatory temperature, they increased the flow of money into their campaigns. Now, the really striking thing to me, though, is after 2008. So after we have the biggest crisis since the Depression, after people independent of Wall Street, like on the left and the right, from Stiglitz to Richard Posner, one of the most important judges in the federal courts, a conservative from Chicago, linked this failure to the misregulation that had basically been purchased by this campaign funding. After the dean of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, confessed that he had been mistaken about the way in which deregulated banks would behave in this context. After all of this, the banks still had the power to blackmail Washington, both Democrats and Republicans alike, into avoiding any major reform of the system, and basically leaving the essential corruption of the system, the too big to fail nature of banking, in place. So, it's frightening enough to think that Congress did such a crazy thing in deregulating in the period up to 2008. But what's terrifying is even after this disaster, the banks have enough power to block effective reform, because Congress depends so critically upon the money that the banks contribute in the context of these elections. The financial service sector was the #1 sector contributing to campaigns in 2010, and they will certainly have an enormous influence in 2012. Yeah, I mean, it feels pretty close. To people inside the system, it's almost impossible to understand what the difference is. So you read Jack Abramoff's book, and Abramoff, says it's legalized bribery. So close was it that effectively every exchange he had with a congressperson had a suggested quid pro quo in it, not explicitly enough to trigger criminal law, but everybody learns how to play the system, and you play the system in a way that makes it so people can signal what they need, and you give it to them so that they get what they need and you get what you need. And I think that's sort of the way this is in Wall Street. There was a great story in 2010, February of 2010 in the New York Times, where there was a story about Chuck Schumer speaking to a group of Wall Street people, and Schumer was basically being attacked by these Wall Street people. One Wall Street executive saying that he wanted his money back from Schumer. He wanted his contributions back from Schumer. And you kind of think, my God, nobody bent over backwards more than Chuck Schumer to give Wall Street what it wanted. And yet these Wall Street tycoons feel entitled to demand even more and feel entitled to be outraged that they didn't get even more in the context of this deregulation game. So, I think that the system evolves to a place where it's so natural to believe that you should be allowed to exert your financial influence in the system that people don't even understand what you could be worried about. And do you think? I just think it's really hard for people to think above ground level. I think they live their life. They work very hard. They're working. Congressmen work extremely hard, most of them, and they're out there raising money. They're on the telephones. They're spending their life inside the system. And to get them to step back and to think about how to change the system is really hard, because who's going to change? Who's going to make the change happen? So for most of them, like most people, they live in a bad system. They just put their heads down and they march forward. And I think at certain moments we got to figure out how to inspire enough people to liberate them so that they could feel like they could do something better than just muddle through in such a broken system. Yeah, I mean, they're not bad people in the sense that they're not focused on breaking the law. But they're certainly responsible for the system. You know, they could change it tomorrow. You don't need a constitutional amendment to produce citizen-funded elections. That would be possible tomorrow. And so they need to do that, and they don't. Well, I mean, it's first important to understand the substantive solution. Like, what should we be aiming for? And if the problem with our current system is that a tiny slice of America funds campaigns, the solution is to make it so all of America is funding campaigns, so that when congressmen are dependent and responsive to their funders, they're also dependent and responsive to America because America is the funder. So some version of a small dollar-funded campaign system, I think, is critical to bringing about a democracy we could trust again. So what is the mechanism that might bring about that solution? Well, you know, I try to struggle with a couple of obvious facts about political reform in America. Number one, in the last 100 years, it has been president-focused. Reform comes from the president. The last time reform came from Congress was the Reconstruction Congress, and that's only because the leader, the president, had been assassinated. So we need a president who can push this issue credibly. And you know, I think one of the problems is that Barack Obama sounded like he was going to push this issue, and then first day in office he became not the reformer, but the kind of let's figure out how we can muddle through with the existing system. So I talk about ways to bring about a president committed to reform that we could believe. Number two, I think we've got to begin to terrorize congressmen into recognizing they need to reform, and you know, peaceful terrorism in the sense of things we could do to congressmen so that they are afraid of not addressing this issue. And I think we still need to think about what those strategies are. But I think the most important long-term solution here is to recognize that it might take the invocation of a way of amending the Constitution that we've never actually seen. And that is the Article 5 convention process, where states call on Congress to call a convention that will then propose amendments to the Constitution. Now, that might be necessary because the other way of amending the Constitution is controlled by Congress. Congress gets to decide which amendments to propose. So unless we can get a system Congress can't control, I think we've got to worry that Congress will never have the incentive to make the kind of reform that it needs. So all of these are kind of outsider reform movements. And I think the critical thing is to recognize that, you know, the outsiders, the kind of sovereign, the people who are not really in the business of producing political wannabe congressman types, but instead, you know, interested in living their life, those outsiders can begin to think about a way to bring about the pressure that they can bring to bear on the system to force the system to change. So I think about the convention not from the perspective of the probabilities of its happening, but more from the perspective of it's the only thing that would work. So given it's the only strategy that would work, and we've got to find a strategy that works, this is the thing to work on. If we had a convention and it were structured in the right way, I do think that it would evolve an understanding of reform that could address the fundamental issues of reform that we need to address. And I would be pushing strongly to think about ways in which we could structure that convention so that it produced the right kinds of reforms. So we shouldn't have a convention that basically deals with issues that the political system is able to deal with. I think we should have a convention to deal with issues the political system is not able to deal with. And so I would address I would think that we could get a reflective understanding of that, to get a convention to propose those kinds of amendments, and then begin the process of trying to ratify them through the political system. Well, the call for a convention is actually happening right now, mainly from conservatives, but increasingly liberals too. Activists, politicians, some law professors, but not many. Law professors are not going to change the world. So I think the most interesting political opportunity with a convention call is that people can be calling for a convention for any number of reasons. As long as they use the same form and states vote for this call, then Congress has to count it, and Congress counts to 34, then Congress has got to constitute a convention. So I think that the process is to get these different political factions to recognize how there's a potentially common strategy here that could at least give them the opportunity to have a platform to put forward their substantive views of what reform is needed. And once we have that platform, actually perhaps think about how to bring about those amendments. Well, I certainly believe that the long-run solution has got to include giving Congress, again, the power to limit, but not to ban, independent expenditures by corporations and individuals alike. So I think that reform has to happen. But the only way we're going to get to a place where that reform is plausible is if we have a cleanly elected Congress first. So I also think we ought to talk about how to get public funding into the system so that we have a Congress that's focused and talks about the difference between being elected by the tiniest slice of the 1% and being elected by all of the people contributing in the way that they would under one of these systems. We have to do both of these changes at the same time. Well, I guess there's nothing surprising about people trying to find a way to influence government. And as libertarians always say, the more government does, the more people will try to find ways to influence government. And some of the strongest libertarians at the founding were not libertarian from some philosophical perspective, but more from a practical perspective. Big government is corrupt government, so therefore we should have small government. Now, I think the thing that is missed sometimes in the comparison to Federalist 10, where Madison talks about factions canceling each other out, is that in some sense it's a clumsy election process. The framers were proud of the fact that they achieved a 2-year election cycle for the House that would keep the House close to the people. But just because 2 years is better than 4 years, it doesn't follow that 1 year is better than 2 years, or that 1 month is better than 2 years, or that 1 day is better than 2 years. And what's interesting about the money game is that you now can begin to see the way in which we've produced a system with 2 kinds of elections. There's the money election and the vote election. And the vote election is highly regulated. Nobody can have more power than anybody else in the vote election. The Supreme Court will strike down any apportionment statute that gives any side more than equal amount of vote. So equality is the norm in the vote election, and it's very heavily enforced. But in the money election, an election that happens every single day, where every single day members of Congress are raising money and trying to attract more money to their side, they're constantly being responsive to, again, the tiny slice of America that's funding. So there's more responsiveness, but it's not responsiveness to everybody. It's responsiveness to a tiny slice of America. So Federalist 10, is talking about this world where the factions have to get together, but the way they exercise their power is through elections every 2 years and every 6 years in the context of the senators who are chosen by the state legislatures at the time of the founding. But now we have factions that manifest themselves every day, appear one day and drive money in their direction, and so the way in which factions operate in this system is just radically much more difficult to control. And so I think one thing to do is just to turn down the faction pressure which would come by removing the way in which money corrupts the process in this system. Yeah, the Supreme Court's getting the wrong answer here, not because it's corrupt. It's getting the wrong answer because it just hasn't worked through, conceptually, the relationship between protection of free speech and protection of the democracy. And it has, as I said, a very narrow conception of the intersection between those two, which is in the field of corruption. So it's okay with restricting free speech when corruption is on the table, but when corruption is not on the table, we can't restrict free speech. But it doesn't understand what corruption means. So I think that the court's got to begin to think more about what a well-functioning election system looks like. And there are lots of examples for it to draw on. The Supreme Court, if you go make an argument in the Supreme Court gives both sides equal time. And they limit the number of briefs that they will consider. They tell you how many pages can be in your brief. And if you're a friend of the court and you want to file a brief, you need permission of the court. And the court will only take so many. So in the context of the court making its own decisions about which side in a case to choose, it has an extraordinary amount of regulation of speech that it builds into the system. Now, I don't think it thinks of itself as violating the First Amendment because it understands that regulation is necessary to make it possible to have a rational judgment about which side should prevail. And I think that just that same kind of understanding needs to be applied a little bit more to the process that we now see elections going through. Nobody can look at the system that we have right now and think that it's producing rational judgments by anybody. And it can't be that the Constitution binds us to an irrational democracy. It must be that we're allowed under the Constitution to structure elections in a way that could begin to elicit once again something other than the crudest, crassest, most polarized kind of political debate driven by endless drive for money. Yeah, so there is a personal dimension to this, which is I've been obsessed for 40 years, literally 38 years, with the way in which institutions become corrupted in a certain sense. And by that I mean, what we sometimes talk about as good Germans inside of an institution. People who are not willing to do what objectively is not a hard thing to do in order to avoid substantial harm by of others. So, my own personal experience included being inside of an institution where there was extensive sex abuse when I was a child. That was enabled by people not willing to pick up a telephone and report what they knew was going on. So that structure of corruption, that structure of malfeasance has been at the center of what I think of when I think of justice from the very beginning of my thinking about these issues. And so it couldn't help but kind of see the same dynamic in the context of the way the current corruption of this political system functions. Because once again, you have people, you have the evil people, like the abuser, you have the Blagojevich, like you have the sex abuser, and those are bad people, no doubt, and they should be criminally prosecuted and punished. But they are enabled by the next circle of people around them, people who don't stop them, don't pick up a phone, don't think about how to change the system to avoid this kind of opportunity or dynamic. And so in my head, these are exactly the same kind of problem. So I can't help but when I think about it, feel it very personally, very directly. And also believe, we're at a stage of, I'm not writing for legal academics. I'm not writing for the political science crowd. I'm really writing, I hope, for citizens. And I think I find that people connect and understand better at a personal level than they do at a theoretical level. So that's certainly part of what might make this successful. I am hopeful because people get it. I had to write a long book to kind of get people, to talk about what I think people get, but people get it. They get that sense of this corruption. They don't have much a sense of what we could do about it, but I think we can show them what we can do about it. And I think that we're beginning to see the revival of a kind of outsider, grassroots citizen movement that can actually achieve its effect. So, you know, Hobbes writes about the sleeping giant, the sovereign, and, you know, sometimes he wakes up. And most of the times when he wakes up, he does a lot of damage. But, you know, that's the only potential that we have. It's to wake the sovereign up, to get it to recognize it has a left hand and a right hand. It needs to learn to walk and speak. But if it can do that, it actually ultimately has the power over others inside the system.